All right, well, welcome everyone. My name's Amanda Burma. I'm a technical marketing engineer with Frog Logic, and today we'll be going over Squish Coco, code coverage and analysis. A little bit about Frog Logic. We are headquartered in Hamburg, Germany, and we also have offices in the US. We're privately held, and we're established in 2003, and we have a large and growing customer base throughout the world. A little bit about Squish Coco. So Squish Coco is made up of a coverage scanner and a coverage browser. And then if you are a Microsoft Visual Studio user, we also have a Visual Studio add-in. The coverage scanner is going to monitor the code that you're executing, and the coverage browser is going to display in a GUI format the results, the analysis, and allow you to interact and see what code you're covering. We support a variety of operating systems, much like if you're familiar with Squish GUI Tester, a variety of operating systems: embedded, Linux, Mac, Unix, and Windows. And also for our code coverage, we cover C, C++, and recently added C# and TCL applications. So what does Squish Coco do? It helps identify dead code, untested code, redundant tests, as well as a number of other things, but those are some of the main things that it'll help you identify, providing in-depth reporting and analysis, as well as insight of your testing coverage at every level of testing, whether you're unit testing, your manual testing, your GUI testing. At every level of testing, this can benefit you. A few more features about Squish Coco. This is going to work with GCC and other platform standard compilers. Today during the webinar, you're going to see me compile everything from Visual Studio, but do know that it works with a variety of platform standard compilers, and then we have a complete command line interface as well as the Visual Studio interface you'll see for simply compiling the application. And then in our coverage browser, we also have a command line interface for that as well. Another thing, we offer extensive code coverage methods or options. So some of you may be familiar with line coverage, function, branch. Many tools will simply have line coverage, for example, but we offer a variety of different coverages, as you can see in front of you here, and we'll look at some of those today, as well as the different information that those various line coverage options can provide. A few other things that Squish Coco does: it also has a feature that helps determine optimal test execution order. So you execute a series of tests, and let's say that you have a limited amount of time. Your tests normally take 6 hours, but you have 1 hour to complete a smoke test. Well, what is going to be your optimal execution order? What's going to be the best order in which to run those tests to cover the most code in the least amount of time? And that's where Squish Coco will help with that as well. It really helps you focus your testing efforts, showing you what you're covering, how much each test is covering, and if you have any redundant tests that really aren't exercising any additional code. And then as you come out with new versions or you want to compare different builds, it will compare the test coverage between your application versions. So I try to keep those slides to a minimum during these webinars, and with that we will dive into the Squish Coco demo. So as mentioned earlier, we support a variety of compilers, right? So all the different platform standard compilers in GCC, and then we also have a Visual Studio add-in. And so today I'm going to simply instrument the code, build this application using Visual Studio, but please do know that it's available from different compilers. So the first thing that we're going to do, I have my solution open. This is my address book application, and I want to tell Visual Studio that I want to compile this application, but I want to compile it with code coverage enabled. So what I'll do is I'll simply come up to Build, Configuration Manager, and you can see I already have one in here. To add this code coverage, you're simply adding something just as you would a debug or release, which are out there by default, but you're giving it a new name. So if I were to click new, I can add in, I'm going to call this one delete me, and then I'm going to copy the settings from release or debug, whichever one you want. And from there I have a new configuration method for building my tool. Now what does that do? Right now it hasn't done anything. It's just a copy of that release configuration. But if I close that and I come over to Tools, Code Coverage Build Mode, here is where I could select delete me, right, the one I just created, and enable code coverage for this project. Now I'm working with a Qt application, so you'll see some of the Qt items in there as well. So that's how you enable code coverage for a particular solution. So I'm actually going to use the one called code coverage instead of delete me. I simply come in here and select enable code coverage. So for this particular configuration, code coverage is enabled. Now when I build my application, it's going to instrument the application. It's going to insert just some flags that indicate to monitor any actions that I perform on the application. And that's also going to generate a database file specific to Squish Coco that's going to let me review all of my code coverage. Now it's important to understand we don't require any code changes to your application, so I didn't touch anything in my application. So we'll come over here and I'm going to select build, and I'll just build the solution. Okay, so now if I come out to my directory where everything was built, remember I made it a copy of that release directory. I just enabled code coverage within it. It generated this CSMES file. Now this file right here is used within the Squish Coco browser, so that's going to be my database file, allowing me to review anything I do within my built application. So let's open up the Squish Coco coverage browser here, and yep, that's the one I want. So I have it open to, remember, that file that was just generated. So what are we looking at right now? We haven't executed the application, we haven't covered any code, but I do want to cover the interface a little bit here. The methods to the top left, you can see any coverage percentages. So right now we haven't covered anything, but it's listing out your different methods, it's listing out your different source. And if we take a look here at, for example, main.cpp, we can see any coverage analysis of this particular file or source file. So as I click on them, it's going to show me any notes related to it. Now right now it doesn't have any valuable information because nothing's been covered, but as soon as we execute our application, we'll see that difference. Now over here in executions, with every execution that we perform, you will be able to see a list of executions. So every time we open up our application, do something with it, you'll see them here, as well as a coverage percentage and an undo redo to see your history of everything that you've done and the differences there. So let's switch back over here to our application. So remember, we don't change any of the code in your application. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of opening up from there, I'm going to open this up from the command line. So the reason I want to do that is because with this application, if we switch back to Squish Coco over here, the coverage browser, you can see when you open the application, there's different flags that you can pass into the application, and based on that, different code is exercised. So for example, if we start the application by just typing in the name of the application and H, let's see if it generated. So what it did is it's simply opening the help for that application by passing in that parameter to the application. Now because I did something with the application, what it did is it generated this CS.exe file. This is my report file. So this is my code coverage database. This is my report file. So I'm going to return back to my coverage browser and load that execution report. So it basically knows the path based on where my database is, unless you have a different path where that report's generated. And then there's some options here. Do I want to open this dialog anytime that this report is updated or a new report is generated? So if you're working through this manually, and every time that you execute your application, exercise the code in your application, you want this dialog to pop up to prompt you to import the latest report. So if you're working through this manually, that's a great option. If you're doing this from the command line and you're automating this as part of a process, you probably wouldn't want that to automatically load. So here I'm going to give this a name, so we'll call this webinar, and I'm going to say this was just the address book with the help parameter. And then I can indicate a status of it. Now this doesn't impact my coverage, whether that it was covered or not. It's simply a status of this particular test. So we'll mark that as passed and click import. There's other options there as well, but we don't need to cover every option during the webinar. Now what it does is it summarizes in the execution report what was just imported. And that gives you a nice indication, especially if you import a new report and it says no changes, well, you haven't covered any new code with that latest execution. So we'll click close, and now you can see in over GoToWebinar the colors can be a little bit different than if you're looking at it in person. The colors are also customizable, as well as the thresholds that indicate what is covered and what isn't covered. So for example, right now we are looking at line coverage. We can see what methods were covered, what source files were covered. And if we look at main.cpp, which is the primary one we'll look at during the webinar today, you can see the various lines that were covered. And as I click on them, I can see an explanation of each coverage down below, so of what was covered. And so you can see how much of this application was covered. This particular this line was executed. Down here, these were not executed. So we're seeing that in line coverage. We also, if we look over at our execution summary, we'll see the name that I gave that report when we imported it. We see the total percentage or coverage for the application. So we covered in that one little execution 6.2% of the application. And remember, I marked it as passed, and I can always add in comments either upon import or simply down here below. The other indicator that we have is our coverage percentage down below. So that's going to be the sum of all executions that are checked. So this one's checked. As we have further executions, you'll see how we can uncheck those, and it provides the sum down here. And then we have our undo redo. So if I wanted to review, okay, going back, looking before anything was executed, now I want to look what was executed. Now this is line coverage. If we take a look, remember I mentioned there were many different coverage method options. If I come down here to coverage method, you can see a variety of different options, each providing different insight into the application and the code that you've covered. So we're going to go with branch, decision, and condition coverage. So if I select that, you'll notice this coverage percentage first of all changed from 6% to 8.4%. because it's a different type of analysis. You'll also notice that what we thought was covered on line coverage, which it was based on line coverage, is not covered under this coverage method because all scenarios were not covered. For example, line 26, we can see here, okay, we evaluated it one way but not the other way. So we haven't exercised every option within that particular line. Yes, we covered that single line, but we didn't cover the conditions. Down here we can see the same. We only used H and not help. We haven't used any of these. So you can see that summary as you come through it, but we did cover the return line. Now let's go back, and instead of executing it by triggering the help, I'm going to execute it, and I'm going to open the application simply by passing in the DE flag to open the application in German. So we can see here now the application's opened in German. Without even exercising anything in this application other than simply opening it in German versus the default, which is English, and closing this, you'll notice how quickly it detected that there was more code coverage. It shows me the report, prompts me if I want to do anything with it, and then so we're going to say address book with, and I'm going to call this DE parameter. Also mark it as passed and click import. Once again, we have our summary. If you don't want this summary, you're able to suppress that window as well. So now we can see our initial coverage, 8.4%, this coverage here, just in opening that application in the German language, we've covered now 20% using branch, decision, and condition coverage. If we were to change this to line coverage, that would be even higher. But we can also see progress down here with what conditions we've covered. So now we've covered yes on that, still no on the French portion. So we haven't added it as French yet. So we'll do one more execution here. Opening up in French, close the application, again importing, and then you can see there's nothing new. Oh, I forgot to rename it. You have the option up here to rename it as well if you'd like, if you forget to rename it on import as I just did. Okay, so we can see now we've increased the coverage. This covers at 21%. We can uncheck these and also see what the coverage is for individual executions instead of the entire thing. And notice my history keeps building. As I want to review my history of the various items that I've covered, I can see that. I've now got my total coverage up here of main.cpp. You can see the colors have changed from red to now orange, so the coverage is higher. These thresholds can be changed. So what is the threshold to change it from red to orange, and what does that dictate? That's all available up here in File, Preferences, and then you have all of your different options. For example, the colors, as well as some people want to change the fonts, and then the thresholds. Okay, so now what can we do with this further? If we want to take a look, we've executed this a few times, right? But what would be the optimal execution order? By simply coming here and clicking Tools, Optimized Execution Order, it generates a report that illustrates that, for example, launching the application, remember this is actually the French parameter because I forgot to rename it, covers 21% using this particular coverage method, whereas the help file only adds, under 2%, adding under 1%. So you can see that if I executed this alone, I would cover the highest percentage of code for my given test suite, if you will, or executions, group of executions, by simply executing this first one. So that can be very helpful when you're trying to determine what execution order is best, is optimal for a given scenario. You'll also notice our total coverage has gone up here. Now what else can I do? Oh, we can see here we've covered this now, all the scenarios. The other thing I can do is I can come up here and we can generate a number of different types of reports. Today we're going to generate the HTML report. Many different options. I'm not going to go through all the options today, but for the most part, what you're viewing in this coverage browser is going to be available in the report. So someone that you want to just send the report to but doesn't have access to the coverage browser is going to have access to a lot of this information, and it creates an interactive report. They can click through the report much as we were clicking through the coverage browser based on the actions we took in the coverage browser. So it's generating that report. And let me see where it generated that report. That'll make it easier. So now, let me open a new window so we don't lose that one. So here's our report. Now, we can see from the report general information, the level 1, so this is what we covered. So that's our overview. What executions did we take? What the status was, the coverage level, what source files. And I'm able to then click into these source files, main.cpp. And remember, hovering over some of those just from the coverage browser was showing me information. As I clicked on them, it was showing me the explanation. It's available here as well. So these reports are really communicating a lot of the information that was available in the coverage browser so that you can communicate that through your entire team. Again, you can click through and see the coverage results. So a lot of information here, any dead code identified, etc. A lot of information in your reports. So that covers the basics of Squish Coco. At this time, I'm going to open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please do post those to the questions area, and we'll answer those questions for you. And while we're waiting for some questions to appear, you can see you're able to go out and evaluate Squish Coco at froglogic.com/evaluate. And then for questions and support during your evaluation, you have support available to you, squish@froglogic.com. And then other resources for information are doc.froglogic.com and kb.froglogic.com. Okay, and so we have some questions coming in here. Is it possible to automate the report generation via batch, for example? Absolutely. So the actions that I took today, because it's a webinar, I try to give it a more visual effect than just sitting in the command line, whereas I know some of you may prefer just watching it from the command line. But all of that can be executed through our command line interface, so you would then be able to automate that whether via a batch or a shell or bash script, etc. Another question is, do you have any suggestions for increasing code coverage and testing? So one of the things that you can do as you're going through looking at your test suite, for example, take your unit test suite, execute what you typically execute, and look at where you are duplicating the review of code. Look at code that you're not exercising and try to determine what actions within the application might exercise that code, and hopefully it's not dead code, but that can be identified as well. So by executing and starting with a base such as what you already have in place, you can quickly see what you are covering. You can see through the analysis what you may be redundantly covering, and then you can see gaps in what you're missing. So by seeing those gaps, seeing what you're missing, and then knowing the portion of the application to exercise to try to hit those, that's how you can begin increasing your testing, your code coverage with testing. As far as experience with big code, we have customers with smaller sets of code and customers with tremendous sets of code. We've also worked with our customers to optimize how Squish Coco works with such large amounts of code, and we have customers that are happy using it with the large amounts of code as well as the performance. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. Please do go out to our website and download an evaluation if you haven't yet, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.